Much. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this extremely special evening. I'm Sam Silver, and I have the honor and the privilege of being the current president of the board of the Pennsylvania Innocence Project. I simply want to welcome you tonight and thank very deeply first Alex Gibney, the director of the program you just saw, Alan Tauber, whom you've seen his work. Now you'll get to ask him some questions. And Alan, congratulations. And more than that, thank you so very much, not just for doing this work, but for doing it pro bono and participating tonight. And last, I want to welcome and thank Chester for participating tonight. I know it's going to be fascinating. I also want everybody participating and everybody who's listening in to know Chester is our newest board member of the Pennsylvania Innocence Project, and that's actually something that was in the works before we knew that he was going to be the star of a Netflix special. So it wasn't just because he was on Netflix, it was because we wanted Chester to be on our board, and I had the great pleasure of presiding over a meeting last week where he was elected to our board. So welcome all, and I'm going to turn the program over now to Nan Feyler, our executive director, who will run the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam, and welcome everyone. We really do appreciate your interest in the issue of wrongful convictions, and particularly around getting to know Chester and what he went through and his attorney, and very glad to have Alex, our director, here. If you finished watching episode 7, you probably have lots of feelings and lots of probably outrage from watching that film, and we'll get a chance to talk about it. If you haven't watched it yet, it's still available on Netflix, as is the whole series, The Innocence Files, which we strongly recommend. We'll still, I think, get something out of the panel this evening. Just briefly, the Pennsylvania Innocence Project, where I'm now currently the executive director, we have 3 goals. The first is to exonerate and free innocent people who are in prison, who are wrongly convicted, like Chester. The second is to try to prevent future convictions of innocent people and work to increase access to justice. And I will say Pennsylvania is one of only 15 states that provides absolutely no compensation or benefits or services after someone's been exonerated. So that's something we're working on as well. And the third thing is we provide services to people who've been exonerated in their transition to freedom. If you want more information about us, you can go to our website, www.innocenceprojectpa.org. Brief introductions. We really want to get talking, so I'll just say very quickly. Alan Tauber is Chester's attorney, as you know. He's currently first assistant at the Philadelphia Defender Association with a long illustrious criminal defense and civil trial experience. He graduated from Rutgers Camden Law School. Alex Gibney is a very well-known and award-winning director who has directed Emmy and Peabody Award-winning Going Clear, Scientology and the Prison of Belief, the Academy Award-winning Taxi to the Dark Side, and the Oscar-nominated Enron, The Smartest Guy in the Room. We're honored to have you today, and so pleased that you chose to make these episodes of this important issue. And of course, Chester, who I personally am so enjoying getting to know. As you know, if you didn't see the film, Chester was exonerated on July 30th, 2019, after spending 25 years in prison, wrongly convicted for something absolutely he did not do. He's, as we said earlier, he's a legal assistant at the Institutional Law Project, and he's recently joined our board of directors. So let's just begin. Let me begin with you, Chester, if you don't mind, because I know people are really going to want to hear from you in particular. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about, the film began when you didn't know you'd be exonerated and you were still in prison. Now you're out, of course, and we're so thrilled. You've had this chance to see the film. What's your reflection of it, and what's the response been and about seeing the film?
I mean, the response has been overwhelming. I mean, you know, when we first, when my lawyer Alan first came to me with the, you know, with the idea of doing it, he said Netflix wanted to do a special, and you know, my only goal was to get out. I'm in prison. There was no end in sight. So my thing was like, you know, I didn't really care, and you know, I really wasn't interested because like I said, I was focused on getting out of prison. So when Alan talked to me a little bit more, and he was like, "This is another avenue for us to get the case out there." And so naturally, I was, you know, that's what we needed. So I was like, "Sure, let's do it." And you know, I'm glad we did it. You know, I never thought that I would be out prior to it coming out. You know, because like I said, I just didn't know what tomorrow was going to hold for me. So, you know, to get out and be able to see it from my living room, it's just, you know, it was overwhelming. You know, and you know, to be here and you know, to see how it all came together, and you know, like I said, it's just I'm just grateful, you know, that they gave me this opportunity for my case to be shown, and you know, for people to get to see the injustices that do happen, you know, because a lot of times people just don't understand or believe that these things can happen the way they do, and they do. So, you know.
You went through so many crushing disappointments. The courts took so long and ruled against you over and over. Did you ever think you'd get out?
In the beginning, in the initial years, I did, because like we were going through the appeal process. But as the appellate process went on and the years started to pass by, and I had 10 years and 15 years, and I'm approaching 20 years, I mean, you know, my hope just diminished a little bit. But at the same time, I knew if someone would just look at the case, you know, because Alan was out here fighting for me, and I had, you know, Arch for Justice, and Investigator Dennis Cross, and I had a bunch of people that were out there fighting for me, but we weren't getting anywhere. So my hope began to diminish a little bit. Like I said, you know, my mom, she told me, you know, in my very first 6 months, she said, you know, you're going to come home. We just don't know how long it's going to be, but you're going to come home. And I kind of held on to that, you know, and, you know, I don't know how, you know, looking back, I don't know how I've made it 28 years, but, you know, I just put one foot in front of the other. I just took it day by day, and I hoped, you know, and, you know, it happened.
I'm so glad. Alan, for you, what was the hardest thing about, perhaps it was how long it took and how hard it was, but what was it like for you and your journey representing Chester?
So I would say there's sort of three things that really were challenging. Number one was confronting a system of justice that is very indifferent to review of conviction, to the point where I was talking to Chester about this earlier, I literally started telling this story to my friends saying, am I crazy? I'm getting laughed at by district attorneys. I'm getting doors shut in my face. I felt, I mean, half of me thought I was getting gaslighted. Then at some point I thought I was crazy, and I just started asking people. I'm sure I bored a lot of people with Chester's story, but that was number one, was getting a system that's indifferent to review, to take a second look. That's number one. Two, getting access to the investigation file, which you know, should be, you know, that should be by any measure automatic. You know,
Is that the district attorney's file, you mean, or the police?
Yeah, the detective's file.
Okay.
You know, to get access to that file, it was like, you know, you're getting through Fort Knox. It's like the crown jewels or something. You could not get there. And then the third thing was getting resources. I was one person. Chester's case washed up on my beach. That's how I describe it. I saw it. You know, I immediately saw it for what it was, and I was essentially one person. I looked for resources, and I will say this: Sam is not pictured now, but he thanked us. I need to turn this around and thank the Innocence Project. I think, give me a moment, because you know, I was working on the case for 5 years, and Marissa Bluestein, who was the founder of the Innocence Project in Pennsylvania, when I worked with her as a public defender, I called her and congratulated her, and she turned right around and said, do you have anything we can work on? I need cases. And I said, that's very generous. I do have a case. And she put the resources of the Innocence Project, modest as they were at the time, at our disposal. And it was and I really, in all honesty, the investigators, the young, very intrepid investigators at the Innocence Project, Marissa Bluestein's enormous experience doing post-conviction work, and that's legal arguments that she shared with us, and the editing she did, and the access she got us through her experience. Those were critical support that we got. And I have to say thank you to the Innocence Project. I cannot say what, I cannot overstate how important an institution that you are. So those were the three things. Getting those resources was very, very important for Chester's case.
And I just want to clarify to people who are listening, that's actually, and thank you very, very much for saying that. It is difficult work, but I think people are relentless at the Pennsylvania Innocence Project. And I just wanted to clarify, it's actually the group that worked with Chester and is the Pennsylvania Innocence Project.
Correct.
For clarity, there's an Innocence Project, which
That's
we
right.
work closely with, that was the first in New York, but we're actually, should be referred to it just as the Pennsylvania Innocence Project in terms of just knowing who we are.
Which is focused on Pennsylvania cases.
Right.
And that's important because Pennsylvania, although there's a moratorium on the death penalty, but there is a large death row in Pennsylvania, and there's a lot of death sentences and life sentences out of Philadelphia, and the work of the Pennsylvania Innocence Project is absolutely critical, to this entire project.
Yeah, most of our clients have life without parole, which means that they can't ever go before the parole board. So it's really a devastating sentence, short of the death penalty.
Right.
And
It was once seen as a remorse. It was once seen as a way to mitigate against the death penalty, but it itself is it's consumed so much it's consumed a lot of the law that it's become. That's another conversation, but there's so many people doing life without parole who have very few resources that it's critical, like institutions like the Innocence Project are there to provide that help.
yeah, people call it death by incarceration.
Yeah.
Alex, thank you so much for making the film. You want to tell us a little bit about how you became interested in telling the story? And I'm curious also what hurdles you must have had to film something, particularly beginning when Chester was behind bars.
Right. Well, originally this is part of a larger project called the Innocence Files, all about the Innocence Project writ large, but also the various Innocence Projects across the country, like the Pennsylvania Innocence Project. And I had known Barry Scheck, who was, one of the founders of the Innocence Project. And when Netflix came to me and said, "Would you like to be involved?" They had me at Innocence Project. I mean, I'm just a big fan of what it is that the Innocence Project does and what all the state Innocence Projects do. They do tremendous work against, tremendous odds, as Alan is pointing out. The system is not designed to admit that it makes mistakes. That's a huge problem with the system. It's designed for closure. As if this was some kind of game where there's winners and losers, and then you just move on, go to the next game rather than people's lives in the balance. So I was hugely interested in doing it. In terms of Chester's case, I mean, we looked at a lot of cases. I was very intrigued by Chester's case, and intrigued in a number of ways that posed certain challenges. One was we didn't know whether Chester was going to get out. And while we were, and for filmmakers, that poses a problem. I mean, it's a bigger problem for Chester. That's a problem he has to live with. But from filmmakers, we didn't know who was going to get out. That was a challenge. The other challenge really also was, trying to persuade the district attorney's office that they needed to give us some access to the process. Because one of the interesting things about Chester's case is the Conviction Integrity Unit, which is unusual if you think about it. I mean, so much about our system is adversarial. You have the prosecutor on one side, you have the defense attorney on the other side, they battle it out, and it's all about winning. It's not always about finding the truth. And so, you know, one of my favorite scenes in the film is when Alan and Patricia Cummings are riding in a car together, tracing the alleged escape route, you know, trying to figure out what happened. You know, defense and prosecution together trying to get to the truth, which you would think would be the goal and the role of the system. So, but at the same time, it was hard initially to persuade the district attorney's office to go along with that because we wanted access. We wanted to see it happen in real time. We didn't want to interview people about what had happened. We wanted to see things happening as it went. It was also important, too, that Chester was willing to engage. I mean, you know, a key beating heart of the film, a number of conversations that Chester had with my producer, Kevin Huffman, over time. And those represent something powerful, which is the idea that Chester was an incredibly intelligent and faithful human being, but he was faceless. All we could do is to hear his voice inside the prison bars, and to hear and for Chester to allow us to record those conversations was also hugely helpful. But it was initially challenging because you have a film and your hero, your main character, isn't seen until the very end. And at the very end, as Chester and I were talking about this the other day, we were all racing to get to that moment when he was released, because the prison, once they knew he was going to be released, wanted to get him out as quickly as possible so there wouldn't be cameras there. And, you know, everybody in different cars from different places were going like 90, 100 miles an hour trying to get to that prison because finally the faceless person, Chester, this guy we had been, you know, our hopes had been on for so long, was going to appear in real life and we were going to see him. So, you know, those were some of the challenges from a filmmaking perspective. Nothing close to the challenges that Chester faced, but anyway, that's what that was part of the process of making the film.
Thank you. Chester, how has it been since you've been out? It's been about 9 months now. How has the transition been?
Still transitioning. It started off rough. Each day I think it gets a little easier for me. You know, it's I thought all those years I just said if I just get out, you know, I just envisioned life just being, you know, but I didn't realize once I got here how much of an effect that was going to actually have on me. You know, not the physical, but just the mental, because like I said, you had to, you know, keep yourself motivated every day. You had to hold on to that hope every day. And mentally it was draining, but I knew I couldn't stop. So when I finally came across that bridge, you know, to get that sigh of relief, and then, like I said, to get home and to be here, you know, it's just like, you know, I'm still like, I just still can't believe it, you know, and I guess I'm still kind of on that prison clock, because like I said, I was just holding on for so long, and now I'm still holding on for some reason. I haven't really come to understand it yet, but, you know, I'm trying to let go. And like I said, every day it's just like, I think I get stronger, wiser. I'm learning a lot more, you know, I'm learning how to work the phone, you know, so, you know, it's a lot of things that I'm becoming accustomed to. And, you know, it's been a different journey, but one that I'm welcoming. So, you know.
Do you have advice for other folks, other exonerees or other innocent people in prison?
I mean, I think each man's walk is going to be different, you know, because like I said, I know there was a lot of guys that I became friends with, and, you know, we all did our time a little different. Even though we were under the same circumstances, we walked a little differently, you know, and I think you just basically just have to hold on to hope. You got to find something to set your sights on and to keep going. And one of the biggest things for me was that I didn't want to succumb to the prison life. You know what I mean? I knew what they had already taken from me, and I said, if I succumb to this life, I'm letting them get me again, and I just couldn't allow that to happen. So, you know, it's what you choose to, you know, who you choose to be, and you know, and what you choose to represent. And you know, well, at the end of the day, you can't never lose hope. You know what I mean? Because if you're innocent, I don't care if it takes 28 years or 38 years, you got to hold on, because, you know, we can't give in. You know what I mean? You have to keep fighting. And, you know, I'm thankful that I did. I'm thankful that I had the people support me that I did, you know, pushing me. And this is the result.
Thank you. Let's shift gears a little bit before we take audience questions. It's a really tough question, but I'm sure it's on everybody's mind, which is how can we what needs to change, first of all, before we talk about how to get it to change. Alan, what do you think in terms of what needs to be done to prevent wrongful convictions? I mean, there's the whole issue of mass incarceration, but we're really talking about the additional tragedy of someone who was innocent in prison.
The first thing I would say is, you know, I listened to Chester talk about, you know, sort of preserving hope and living a certain way and not succumbing, I guess, to despair. The first thing I would say is that, and I said this in the movie, change is possible. Systemic change is possible. Politics matter. There are answers, and we become cynical. We become a little jaded about politics for many good reasons. But the biggest reason Chester is out today is because there was a political movement and a political decision by the people of Philadelphia that opened the door to the district attorney's office, that opened the door to a reconsideration of Chester's case. That was the most important thing. And it makes a difference. It made all the difference. And so the first thing I would say is that, you know, yes, change is possible. And in our system, it's primarily, or it will most dramatically happen through political change, although it is completely possible through incremental change as well. That's number one. Two, we need more organization. Again, we need organizations like the Innocence Project. We need resources for organizations like the Innocence Project and lawyers and others who would be willing to work and investigate cases like this. From a very down at the ground level, the investigation files have to be made available. That's the soil that exonerations take root in. You know, there's some. I'm not familiar with the work across the country, and my understanding is that some states have that, but the homicide file, the detective's file, should be an open book. And if it was an open book in this case, I am absolutely convinced Chester Hollman would never have gone to jail, because what we discovered in that file would have not just pushed this case beyond reasonable doubt, but would have shown Chester's innocence. And so that needs to happen. I guess there's some other details. Philadelphia is doing this now, recording interviews. One of the issues in this case was these interviews are done in the shadows, in the dark, and then they become questions of the integrity and credibility of the parties involved. So the officers will say, no, you know, this was just an honest, open interrogation, when we all know that was not the case, that this was the opposite of that. If you record the interview, if you record what happens between the police and the witnesses, you are much more likely not to have convictions based upon corrupt testimony and corrupt statements. So, I mean, I could go on, but those are really highlights as I see them.
And of course, this episode was really focusing on prosecutorial misconduct. And a lot of what you talk about, Alan, is to really shine some light on what the police and the prosecutors are doing, so that evidence is available. And this film talked a lot about how once the cops decided who had done it, and the recantation, but particularly just it's a mentality that keeps everything secret. So this story talks about the importance of, or the damage that does, the tragedy, the crisis, and how Patricia Cummings really sort of turned the tide.
Right.
Chester, do you have thoughts about what should be different?
I mean, for me, I mean, just me personally, I mean, there's no deterrent. You know, these things happen, and you know, there's no repercussions for the prosecutors or police officers who do this. I mean, they did it so effortless. You know what I mean? It was effortless. You know, to see what they did. And I'm sitting here and I'm watching it. I'm in this room and I'm going through this system. I'm just watching it, and I can't believe it's happening. And you know, then even after it's it's found out, there's still no repercussions.
Yeah.
You know, they go on with their lives. You know, and you know, I lost so much. You know, not just only me, but everyone who's been falsely in prison, and you know, all the exonerees who have gotten out. These people have gone on with their lives, and they live their lives, and you know, and we're left to pick up the pieces. And you know, I just think that there's no deterrent, and something has to be done about that. You know, if you're found that there's misconduct, there should be a price you have to pay, whether it's prison or loss of job or loss of a pension, whatever the case may be. But something has to be done in that regard, I think.
Very good.
Yeah, sorry.
Amen to that.
Sorry, Alex, go ahead.
Yeah, amen to that. I mean, unless there is a mechanism for holding prosecutors or cops to account who commit to a lie, and that was the damage here. You know, early on they committed to a lie. And if you think about it, I mean, yes, there has to be a system of holding them to account in some fundamental way, or they keep doing it. There's not a system of incentives that offers them, you know, another path. But also, if you think about it, you know, one of the interesting things about this story, which we didn't expect to get to, was that they put Chester in prison because they committed to a lie early on, one that allowed them to tick the box, to put the notch in their belt, to move on, say we got a conviction, that he was a bad guy, they move on. Well, guess what? The very next day after they had committed to the lie, they found the likely perpetrators. But did they go after them? Did they change their minds? Did they say, oh, we must have been wrong? No, they leave the perps out on the street where they can do more damage to other people. So there's another aspect to this, which is really which is equally damaging, because not only did they put an innocent man in prison, but you know, to people, they ignore people who are actually doing the real damage to citizens on a daily basis. So, you know, it's really a big problem. Once you have this, it's the flaw of the adversarial system, where if it becomes all about winning or losing rather than finding the truth, and if there's no, you know, either way of holding people to account, or at some point in time being open to the idea that people either made mistakes or intentionally lied, you know, in order to do the wrong thing, there has to be a way of dialing that back rather than the default position being no. Because remember, the other thing about Chester's case, it's so important, is that, you know, the testimony from Deirdre Jones and Andre was, you know, they lied initially, okay, but then for them to recant means that the judge, as a default mechanism, is always going to believe what they said first, or they're going to consider them as unreliable witnesses and therefore allow the original judgment to stand. Well, what sense does that make? It means it's like a mechanism for a system of lying, because if you get somebody to tell a convincing lie up front, then the judge, in all likelihood, is never going to unwind it.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was a long rant, but you know, I learned a lot on this case.
I think this is all about rants, really.
Yeah.
Let me stop us right now, though. And Coley, would you like to join us and share? Coley, I've asked Coley to, or actually Coley came up with the idea that she would facilitate some questions from the folks who are observing, and we'll see who will facilitate point of view answering. So do you have any questions, Coley?
Yeah, there are actually a lot of questions and they're all really good. So forgive me if I don't hit yours. And remember, please do use that Q&A function. That's the best way for me to see them. We have a lot of people asking, specifically Chester, how he is able not to hold on to anger or be bitter or hold grudges. One person even asked, or are you holding any grudges?
Chester, do you want to?
You know, I've been asked that a lot, and you know, it's not that I'm not angry, but I just think that, you know, if I'm being honest, you know, I don't have it in me. I think I was just broken. You know, it broke me. And, you know, I was trying to hold on to what I had left. I didn't have enough strength for anger, you know, so I just held on and, you know, and I just tried to hide my brokenness, you know, and, you know, so it's not that I wasn't angry or I'm not mad or disappointed, you know, I'm all that. You know, how can you not be, you know, but at the same time, like I said, I just feel like I was broke, you know, because I believed in the system and it failed me. So, you know, I just, you know, so it's not that, you know, I don't want people to think that I'm not angry or I'm just, you know, just skating. No, I'm very angry, you know, especially what it did to my family, you know, watch my mother, you know, and what it did to her. So, you know, but like I said, I just think that I just try to find a different way. And another thing, I didn't want the anger to consume me. You know, it was hard enough doing the time that I did, you know, so I just thought the anger would just take a little bit more from me. And I needed all the strength I could to, you know, to keep going. So I just tried to, you know, hold off and, you know, stay as humble as I could.
Thank you.
Great. We have another handful of questions asking specifically about Roger King and if the Pennsylvania Innocence Project or the CIU are systematically looking over reviewing cases that involved him. Let's see, there was also a question about Roger King.
While you're looking, Alan, do you know the answer to that?
So I would say this, that there have been other cases. My understanding is there's been other cases that have been reversed, or there have been other, courts have taken action over some of the tactics Roger King was involved in. There is a unit at the Federal Defender Association that represents strictly people on death row. They have done a comprehensive review of all of Roger King's work and have actually created a sort of database of that. I would say this, and not speaking on behalf of the CIU, but if they get a case that there's any questions about and they see the prosecutor was Roger King, that will, I think, give credit. I don't know if you want to say credibility, but they will start to look more closely at it. I think his appearance in a case raises certain presumptions that it's worth looking at carefully.
Thank you.
Great. So a follow-up question to that we got from Reggie Shuford. Some of you may know, he's the executive director of the ACLU of Pennsylvania. Hi, Reggie. It says, as a Black man and a civil rights attorney, I am especially disgusted by Roger King's role in Chester's conviction. Of course, the irony of a white prosecutor being essential to his release looms large. Can someone comment on the racial overtones of Chester's case?
I'll just say this, that there's no question that Roger King was deployed in I don't know if you want to say a cynical way, but he was definitely utilized by the district attorney's office from the race standpoint. There's no doubt about that. So that was definitely there.
What I'll comment on, and I don't have the figures at my fingertips, but can get them if anyone contacts the Pennsylvania Innocence Project. It's going to be no surprise our clients represent the racist and racial nature of who is incarcerated. Most of our clients are African-American men, not all, but most. And when there's been a study, there's a registry of exoneration, National Exoneration Registry, or Registry of Exoneration. They did a story on race and innocence and found the many more African Americans are disproportionately convicted who are innocent or than other innocent people. I'm not being very clear, but the racial disparity is throughout even the wrongful convictions. And in fact, if a victim is white and the defendant is Black, they're much more likely to be convicted even when innocent.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think anyone's surprised that racism runs through the criminal justice system, perhaps, as it does in every aspect of our society. But it may be it may be even more exaggerated in the criminal justice process. I don't think anyone will be surprised by that at all.
Coley?
Okay, this is from Mark Simmons, who I believe is with the Innocence Project of Florida. Hi, Mark. General question: do you think that the pressure through the press is an effective way of getting the judicial system to take a case seriously?
That's a good question.
It is a good question. I'd like to know the answer to that. I mean, I assume that it is, but I don't know. I mean, I do think that embarrassment can be an effective tool. And I know one of the reasons we highlighted the Philadelphia Inquirer article, the one about test the lying, was that it really did put on the front, literally on the front page, evidence of a deep flaw in the system and clearly an injustice in Chester's case. And I think it embarrassed people. And when you embarrass people, then sometimes you get an opportunity for change. And so I think that, when you have whether it be filmmakers or reporters, uncovering this kind of stuff and putting it in the light of day where otherwise it would be hidden, then there is an opportunity to hold people to account.
I'd like to comment on this if I could, because the press did play a unique role in this case. And I gave a lot of thought to the press, and we reached a point at some point in Chester's case where we were out of appeals, we were out of court, and we had no, other than just doing the seed work of actual investigation. We didn't really have any, we had nowhere to go. And I started banging on. So initially I did not want the Chester story told. It kind of, ironically, I did not want to try to embarrass the DA's office because I wanted them to look at the case carefully and take it seriously. And I didn't want them to think I was going to showboat this or humiliate them. I really tried to get them to do this in a discreet way, and they look at the evidence. But once we were out of court, I did 180 degrees, and I said, we need to try to use the press to look for some leads. And I tried, and eventually got, John Martin, you saw this, he agreed to write the story. And it was a Hail Mary. I was hoping somebody would see this, know something about it, and call somebody and get evidence. And that's what that was about. The last thing I'll say about this was that didn't happen. We did not get any leads from that. But what did happen was when we filed our petition with the DA's office, the first thing they did was pull up that Inquirer story. And then Rabia Chaudhry did a podcast. As a result of the Inquirer story, Rabia Chaudhry did a podcast called Undisclosed, 4-part, and she did her own independent investigation. The DA's office read that story, listened to that podcast, and that made a difference, I think. It lent credibility. Serious writers, serious journalists took this seriously and had made their own judgment. And I honestly believe that had an impact on the DA's, judgment in this case. It certainly was able to help us confirm that this was worthy of review. So, there were a lot of different reasons to engage the press or not engage the press, and they were all present in Chester's case.
Coley? Thank you, Alan.
Great. Kim Oxholm is asking to know more about how Alex and Alan connected to get the story told.
Well, once we decided to do the story, I mean, my producers, Brad Hebert and Kevin Huffman, reached out to Alan. I mean, it was kind of natural. He was the guy who had been carrying the flag for Chester. So that was it. Now, it's interesting talking about this whole thing about lawyers and the press. I mean, as Alan just said, sometimes lawyers like to lock the press out, and they don't like to share for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes not wanting to have to, embarrass judges, because sometimes judges can be vindictive and it's not good, but sometimes it can pay off. And so sometimes we're at odds, but sometimes, as in this case, it seemed to make a tremendous amount of sense to engage with each other because there was an important story to be told. And telling the story, not only of Chester, but also telling the story of Alan trying to get justice for Chester was an important part of that too.
Chester, did you have any feelings about any of the press that was going on?
Well,
from,
I really wasn't privy to it. I mean, I saw the article, I saw the paper, because, you know, a couple of guys in the institution got the paper and they brought it to me. But, you know, like I said, when I was on the inside, like I said, everything that was going on and, you know, everything that Alan was telling, you know, I just couldn't wrap my head around it because, like I said, my focus was making it through each day. I mean, it takes a real mental fortitude to, like, walk those halls every day. And, you know, so I just tried not to lose focus of that. So when it came to the press, I saw the article, I read it, I gave the paper back, and then I went about my day, you know. You know, like I said, I was there, and that's what I had to focus on. Yeah. That's what I focused on. Yeah. You know.
Great. I've got a question for Chester from Julie Checkaway. How are you handling the situation of the pandemic? You know, you've finally gotten freedom, and now we're all confined to home. Is it traumatizing, or is it so much more freedom that it's still a relief?
I mean, for me, I guess, you know, it's been 9 months, so, you know, I'm not gonna say I enjoy it, but I don't mind it because, like I said, you know, 28 years of being around nothing but people every minute of the day, you know, I like my little solitude. I like it, you know, being able to just sit down and not hear a bunch of voices, and, you know, so, you know, I'm taking it as it comes. You know, it's sad, you know, the cost of it, you know, but at the same time, you know, if we have to be in, you know, I don't have a problem staying in.
We have several questions for Alan about how he determines which cases he takes on pro bono, what attracted him to Chester's case in the first place.
I don't really have a rule of thumb on this. Chester's case came to me through a partner of mine who I was working with at the time. To be, perfectly honest, I read the file. I, immediately realized Chester was innocent. Unfortunately, at the time, I didn't have much I could do for him. In the course of that initial representation, Deirdre Jones' recantation came in, and at that point, I knew we were onto something. It's just what I tell people, and I tell some of the young lawyers in my office is, you try to do the good that's in your reach, and this came into my reach, and it was so obvious and so self-evident. You got to just let your, it was a matter of conscience for me, which was, if I stopped, how was I going to feel next week or next month? And it was pretty evident to me that that was not going to be a good feeling. And I just hung on to it.
And at the Pennsylvania Innocence Project, we get about 500 letters a year from folks who are incarcerated asking for our help. And we have actually, we're a very rigorous review of all letters, several stages of review with lawyers and law students and volunteer attorneys, looking at cases where there's ultimately where we can believe that, and we do pretty intensive investigation with our we have an excellent investigator working with us. So our position is really, we have a backlog. There's more demand than we're a 9-person small office, but we work very hard to answer everybody's mail, to be in touch with people. And then we actually take on cases and represent cases where there's enough evidence of actual innocence that we can go to the court and make the argument. So there can be cases where deadlines have passed or where there is no new evidence to reopen the case. The laws, it's, as people say, very easy to get convicted, particularly if you're an African-American man, and it's extremely, extremely difficult to get exonerated. Cases take about 10 to 15 years. They're very laborious, as Alan has demonstrated. And it's an uphill fight all the way.
Yeah.
We've had 18 exonerated in Pennsylvania. In history, we're very excited.
Great. We have Similar questions from Maria Shop and Renee Randolph and a couple of anonymous attendees. Has anyone else been prosecuted for the killing? Is the DA now pursuing charges? Was the real perpetrator ever found?
So the answer is no. Through our investigation, we believe we identified the people involved. We had a lot of great deal of confidence. The problem is, and as Alex indicated, when the focus of investigation is on the wrong people, it ends the investigation. Well, let me put it this way. A police investigation starts out as a search for the truth. At some point, my experience is when the police determine or the investigators determine they have identified who it is, it no longer becomes a search for the truth. It becomes a search for evidence to advocate or search for evidence to build a case of conviction. So once the police decided Chester and Deirdre were the people involved, they stopped investigating. They stopped trying to determine what happened and who did it, and started to try to gather evidence to convict Chester. That meant all of the witnesses who were out there, and there were many, were not shown the pictures of the alternative suspects. And now 28 years later, no one could obviously make that, they stopped trying to gather evidence or track down the people who did it. And at this point, the simple reality is it's too late. It's impossible to rebuild a case. And that's part of the sad reality behind wrongful convictions. It's, as Alex said, it's not just the wrong person goes to jail, but guilty people get off. And I don't know if they did other crimes in this case or not, but the cold-hearted and brutal nature of this crime tells me that's quite possible. This was a cold-blooded killing. The people who involved in this deserve justice, and it's never going to happen now.
We had said that we would end at 8:15. It's a little past that, but I think this conversation is really compelling. If people would like to stay on, why don't we take, how about 10 more minutes of questions? Is that all right with the panelists?
Sure.
Okay. Are there more questions, Coley?
Yeah, a ton more. So Ellie Thompson, who is one of our wonderful volunteers, hi Ellie, is there no civil remedy for the wrongful incarceration of a woman?
I'll start out by saying again that, and then Alan, you can jump in, but many states provide compensation for every year that a person has been incarcerated who is innocent, as well as services, including health insurance, some tuition reimbursement, sometimes housing assistance. In some ways, the irony and the tragedy is that when someone who is innocent is exonerated, they're not even eligible for the services of parole. So they come out of prison with absolutely nothing. No compensation, no funding, no support, no vouchers, no nothing. We have some services at the Innocence Project, but that's one of the ways that I think we need to sort of really look at this whole, the services and the compensation that's available. We'll do sue civilly, and maybe Alan, do you want to talk about that?
I'll just say this, that, as Nan said, 2/3 of the states in the union provide compensation, regardless of whether it was misconduct or whatever the case may be. Pennsylvania needs to do this. Okay, there are enough exonerations in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania needs to do this. It does not do it. Federal law does provide certain rights with respect to people in Chester's circumstance who have been wrongfully convicted because of the misconduct of the police or the police department or the city. And Chester is wondering, whether or not he has a claim based upon those federal rights. And if he does, I don't think anybody at all would blame him for pursuing that. So that's being investigated. I personally hope that there is a claim. and that he gets, he's compensated in a way that he can take care of his family and never have to, have a anxiety about income for the rest of his life. I don't know where that will go, but aside from that, every state should have a fund. That, without question, is.
And not every exoneree is going to win a lawsuit. So
Correct.
It's not as though there's an alternative for many or most exonerees. There's nothing.
Correct.
And I think the folks that we work with, that's been the most painful thing about the transition. Is very difficult. And if you have no financial support, practical support, or benefits, it prolongs the crisis.
Craig Stevens has a question for Chester. How are your dad and sister doing since your release?
They're doing great. We haven't really, since I came out, we really haven't talked about it much. I mean, we say little things, but, I think we've just more or less taken in the moments that, of being here opposed to, what we've been through. And, but they're doing good. My dad, he's 70, like 76, but he, he's in his mind, he still thinks he's 50, so he's got this young spirit and, he's very outgoing. And, my sister, she's just a beautiful soul. And, she's just, they're great, and like I said, it's thrilled me more than anything. And, and I don't just say this, I mean this from the bottom of my heart. It thrilled me more than anything and being able to see them smiling and I had to go through that. That was probably the hardest thing for me, knowing my family had to go through that. I mean, because like I said, I'll do what I got to do. If I got to eat it, I'll eat it, and and so be it. But to watch your family have to go through it, so to be here and and to see them, happy and content with me being here, that's meant the world. So, they're great.
Great. There's another question from an anonymous attendee. How has the system been changed by Chester's case? And a related question from Kim Oxholm again is this still happening as frequently today as it was 28 years ago?
I'd say Kim's question, I would say yes. I don't think, I guess I can't say that with authority. I think but certainly there are many exonerations happening of people who've been incarcerated. And I think we've talked about reforms like open files and recording interviews and changing the mentality, the best practices of district attorneys to not try to prove your case, but try to find the evidence. And I think we have a long ways to go for that to be universally accepted. District attorneys' offices work very much in isolation. There's county by county, so it's tougher to make systemic change. What would you say, Alan?
Yeah, so I would say I hate to say that I don't think that this is like Chester's case would be a turning point. I think he is a point along a continuum of many other points that, a prosecutor like, so I'll say this, that the era where Chester was convicted there was many more abuses that I think we see today for a lot of reasons. Some of it's technology, some of it's, progressive prosecutors like Larry Krasner have come forward, made certain changes, and just, the city has moved on from some very, a very bad era and so forth. Chester's era, there is a lot of cases that have come back. And I think in Chester, we sat in Larry Krasner's office and every one of those exonerees was your age, right? I mean, it was all from that age. So yeah, I would say that Chester's case per se, I wouldn't say if has changed anything exactly, but Larry Krasner's a prosecutor who came up in that era, saw cases like Chester's, knew what was going on. So yes, I mean, in the sense that Chester's case is representative of what was happening, and it informed a progressive prosecutor like Larry Krasner. It has definitely made a difference because that has driven a lot of his views. It drove his policy, and he put that into effect on the ground by creating the Conviction Integrity Unit.
Do you think, Alan, that things have changed so that fewer innocent people are getting convicted now?
I want to say yes. I want to say I believe that's true. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. In large measure, the institutions are what they are. They're the same issues we're dealing with forever. But they are doing things. There are things that have been done. There are things that are being done a little differently. And certainly, this prosecutor's office has prosecuted cases differently.
Yeah.
And made access to information better. But yes, I think institutionally the same issues still exist. So the capacity for these things, for these kinds of cases are there, and if the capacity is there, they're happening.
Maybe one more question, Coley?
Sure. I think this is a good final question. It's we have a couple of folks asking how can they help the Pennsylvania Innocence Project in some way, and especially if they're not an attorney.
So that's a great question, and an important question. We have developed on our website, we have 4 things you can do in response to watching the Innocence Files and Chester's episode. We do take volunteers, but primarily lawyers or law students. Sometimes we take communications volunteers or development volunteers, but we have very little capacity. So we are always fundraising because we're such a small staff for a big state. We have a Pittsburgh office as well as a Philly office. So if you go to our website, you can get some ideas about what to do. If you sign up for our mailing list, we will keep you posted as we do more advocacy. For example, in the fall, we're going to kick off a campaign for compensation for exonerees. So I would say get involved if you can, at least remotely, and then take a look at some of the suggestions we have on our webpage. And our webpage is Innocence PA, www.innocencepa.org. And I think
projectpa.org, sorry.
Oh, there you go. Say it again.
www.innocenceprojectpa.org.
Exactly. But thank you so much. Certainly thank you, Alan and Alex and Chester, for a tremendous evening of conversation and commitment and passion. I think I know we all share enormous respect for all Chester. You're, I think, a remarkable man, and that we're all glad to know. And I'm so happy you're going to be more involved with the Pennsylvania Innocence Project. So thank you for signing up. Thank you for your questions. You can contact us, go to our website. There's an email address there, and stand